Who let you wear that bikini? The words didn't just drift across the water, they cut through the humid Seoul air like a blade, sharp, dangerous, and possessive in a way that made the oxygen leave my lungs. I spun in the infinity pool, droplets of water flying like shattered glass, and found Kang Jae-sung standing at the edge. His expression was thunderous. His dark, unblinking eyes tracked every curve the red fabric revealed, every inch of skin the water kissed. "Excuse me?" I managed to choke out. Indignation flared hot in my chest, even as something deeper and more primal stirred low in my belly. He didn't answer. He simply began to circle the pool, like a predator stalking prey, never breaking eye contact. Who gave you permission to look like that? I don't need permission for my... The wave hit without warning. A surge from a passing yacht crashed over the infinity edge, throwing me off balance. I gasped, arms flailing for a hold that wasn't there, and then, suddenly, his hands were on me. He gripped my waist, pulling me flush against his soaked black dress shirt as the water churned around us. His fingers splayed across my ribs, warm and unyielding against my wet skin. Our faces were inches apart, close enough to see the icy gold flecks in those dark, furious eyes, close enough to feel his ragged breath against my lips. "Jae-sung," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I should let go," he said, his voice a rough, low growl. "Yes," I breathed. But neither of us moved. His tattooed thumb traced the line where the red bikini met my skin, feather light and devastating. 48 hours, he murmured. "You gave me 48 hours to keep you safe from the syndicate." He pulled me a fraction closer, his chest a wall of solid heat. "But, Seraphine, I'm not sure I can keep you safe from me." I leaned into the danger, surprised by my own boldness. "Maybe I don't want safe, not from you." Welcome back to the world of the syndicate, where every choice is a debt, and every debt is paid in blood. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button because we're about to dive into a world where desire is the most dangerous weapon of all. Now, let's rewind 24 hours. Let me tell you how a freelance restoration artist ended up in a red bikini in a private infinity pool in the arms of a man who was either going to save her soul or destroy her life completely. The ink on the ledger smelled like a death sentence. I set the magnifying glass down on the mahogany desk, watching the shadows of Seoul's underworld begin to stretch across the floor. The solvents smelled like old memories and fresh threats. I leaned back from the easel, my neck cracking after 6 hours of hunched, meticulous labor. Before me sat the White Peonies, an 18th century masterpiece that had arrived at my studio under a shroud of heavy secrecy and even heavier debts. My father had left me a legacy of fine brushes and a ledger of red ink, money owed to men who didn't care about the stroke of a brush, only the weight of a coin. I picked up the scalpel, intending only to clean the frame's inner edge, but the blade caught on a seam that shouldn't have been there. My breath hitched. With a steady hand, I peeled back the silk backing, expecting rot or aged wood. Instead, a slim, leather-bound book slid into my palm. I opened it, and the world seemed to tilt. This wasn't a restoration record. It was a map of blood, names of politicians, shell companies, and transaction amounts that looked like phone numbers. The Korean syndicate. My father hadn't just owed them money. He had been their vault. A cold shiver raced down my spine, the kind of instinctual dread that tells you the hunter is already at the door. I had just become the most dangerous woman in Seoul, not because of what I could do, but because of what I knew. I scrambled to hide the ledger, but the air in the studio changed. The low, rhythmic hum of a high-performance engine vibrated through the floorboards, cutting through the silence of the industrial district. I rushed to the window, pulling the heavy velvet curtain aside, just enough to see. A black sedan, polished to a mirror finish, sat idling at the curb. It looked like a hearse for someone who hadn't died yet. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out. Even from the second floor, his presence felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Kang Jae-sung. He didn't look at the building. He didn't have to. He moved with the terrifying certainty of a man who already owned the ground he walked on. His black overcoat flared as he strode toward my entrance, his silhouette sharp against the streetlights. He wasn't a cleaner sent to dispose of a witness. He was the boss. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I looked at the painting, then at the ledger, then at the heavy steel door of my studio. The lock clicked. It wasn't a forced entry. It was a cold, calculated arrival. Jae-sung stepped into the room, the scent of expensive sandalwood and rain preceding him. He didn't say a word. He simply let his eyes wander over the restoration tools, the peonies, and finally, my trembling hands. "The restoration is finished, Seraphine," he said, his voice a low, melodic threat that made my skin prickle. "But your life of a ghost is over." He took a step closer, the space in the studio suddenly feeling microscopic. "The syndicate is 5 minutes behind me. You can stay here and die for a debt that isn't yours, or you can come with me and belong to a man who can actually keep you alive." I looked into those dark, unblinking eyes and realized I wasn't choosing between safety and danger. I was choosing which cage I wanted to live in. The heavy steel door didn't just close, it sealed the world away with a final, metallic thud that vibrated in my teeth. I hadn't even reached for my coat before the first scream echoed from the hallway, a sharp, strangled sound that was silenced as quickly as it began. I froze, the leather-bound ledger clutched to my chest like a shield, but Jae-sung didn't flinch. He simply checked a heavy gold watch on his wrist, his expression as calm as a frozen lake. "They're here," I whispered, my voice trembling. "My men are faster," he countered, his tone devoid of any doubt. Through the frosted glass of the studio windows, shadows danced in a frantic, violent ballet. Muffled thuds and the sharp crack of a silenced pistol punctuated the night, stripping away the illusion of my quiet life. Vernon's cleaners, the syndicate's finest, were being dismantled in the dark by a force far more efficient, far more terrifying. A sudden explosion of splintering wood came from the back entrance. I gasped, stumbling back into a rack of drying canvases, but Jae-sung was a blur of motion. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He moved into my personal space, his scent of sandalwood and cold rain overwhelming the acrid smell of paint thinner. Before I could protest, his arm hooked under my knees and the other behind my back, hoisting me into the air as if I weighed nothing at all. "Put me down! I can walk! I can—" "You can die," he interrupted, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a possessive intensity that froze the breath in my throat. "Or you can trust that I am the only thing standing between you and a shallow grave in the Han River. Choose now, Seraphine. I don't have time for your pride." I looked past his shoulder at the door, a gloved hand gripped the frame, followed by the glint of a blade. But before the intruder could step through, a shadow materialized behind him. One swift, brutal movement, and the intruder was gone, dragged back into the darkness by one of Jae-sung's silent sentinels. Jae-sung didn't wait for my answer. He turned and strode toward the freight elevator, his grip on me tightening, his chest a wall of unyielding muscle against my side. As the elevator doors hissed shut, the sounds of the struggle faded, replaced by the low, mechanical groan of the cables. He didn't look at the floor numbers, he looked only at me, his thumb absent-mindedly stroking the fabric of my sleeve, in a gesture that felt less like comfort and more like a mark of ownership. We emerged into the alleyway where the black sedan sat waiting, its engine a low, predatory growl. Rain began to fall, slicking his dark hair and beating on his overcoat. He didn't set me down until we reached the open door of the vehicle. From this moment, Seraphine Vale no longer exists. You aren't a restorer, you aren't a debtor, and you aren't free. You are dead to the world, and you belong to the shadows. You belong to me. The door slammed shut, and as the car tore away into the Seoul mist, I watched my studio, my entire life, vanish into the rearview mirror. The transition from the chaos of the city to the unnatural silence of the coast was more jarring than the extraction itself. I awoke to rhythmic crashing waves, a stark contrast to the staccato rhythm of gunfire that had haunted my dreams. The room was vast, an architectural masterpiece of glass, polished concrete, and silk, bathed in the soft, bruised light of a pre-dawn sky. For a moment, I forgot the ledger, I forgot the blood, I forgot the man with the tattooed throat who had claimed me as his own. Then, the memory of Jae-sung's weight against mine flooded back, and I bolted upright. The sheets were Egyptian cotton, cool and mocking against my skin. My studio clothes had been replaced by a silk robe that felt like a second skin, another layer of his ownership. I didn't wait to wonder who had changed me. I had to move. I crossed the room, my bare feet silent on the heated marble floors. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I saw the estate, a sprawling fortress of white stone, perched precariously on a jagged cliff overlooking the East Sea. It was beautiful, the kind of luxury that felt like a curated lie. I reached the glass door leading to a private terrace, my fingers trembling as I gripped the handle. It didn't budge. There was no visible lock, no latch, just a seamless integration of glass and frame that refused to yield. I moved to the main bedroom door, the heavy oak carved with intricate patterns. I turned the handle, expecting resistance, but it swung open with a whisper. My heart leapt. Maybe I wasn't a prisoner. Maybe the dead to the world speech had just been a flair for the dramatic. I hurried down a corridor that smelled of expensive ozone and sea salt, my eyes darting toward any sign of an exit. I found the grand foyer, where the morning light spilled across a massive obsidian sculpture. The front doors were tall, imposing, and unguarded. I lunged for them, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps, but as I reached within 10 feet of the entrance, a soft electronic chime echoed through the hall. The air seemed to shimmer. A red laser lattice, nearly invisible until the light hit it at an angle, flickered into existence across the doorway. It was a high-frequency security grid, the kind used to protect national treasures, or to cage them. I wouldn't, a low, resonant voice drawled from the shadows of the mezzanine. I whirled around, my back hitting the cold obsidian of the sculpture. Jae-sung stood above me, his black shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a crystal glass of amber liquor in his hand. He didn't look like a man who had been up all night fighting a war. He looked like a king surveying his domain. "Is this the safety you promised?" I yelled, my voice cracking with a mixture of fear and fury. "A high-tech cage?" He descended the stairs, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't stop until he was standing in my personal space, the heat radiating from him in waves. He reached out, his fingers grazing the silk of my sleeve. "The world thinks you are a pile of ash in a burnt-out studio, Seraphine. If you walk through that door, you make a liar out of me, and I do not like being called a liar." He leaned down, his breath warm against my ear. "The security is there to keep the syndicate out, but don't misunderstand, it is perfectly capable of keeping you in." The dining table was a vast expanse of dark, polished mahogany that felt more like a boardroom than a place for a meal. I sat at one end, the silk of my robe feeling thin and vulnerable against the high-backed velvet chair, while Jae-sung sat at the head. A A single candelabra flickered between us, casting long, dancing shadows that played over the sharp angles of his face. The food was exquisite, delicate sea bass and crisp greens, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. "Eat," Jae-sung commanded, his voice barely louder than the clink of his silver fork. "You'll need your strength for what comes next." "What comes next is me leaving," I said, setting my cutlery down with a sharp snap. "You said 48 hours. You didn't say anything about laser grids and silk leashes." Jae-sung didn't look up, but the air in the room grew heavy, a physical pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. "The terms have changed because the stakes have changed, Seraphine. The syndicate isn't just looking for a ledger now. They are looking for the woman who saw their shame. My protection isn't a suggestion, it's a mandate. But it requires something you're not used to giving." He finally looked at me, his gaze so intense it felt like he was peeling back the layers of my skin to see the secrets beneath. "Total transparency. I need every name your father mentioned, every contact, every brushstroke you made on that painting that wasn't part of the original. If you hide a single detail from me, I cannot guarantee you'll see the sunrise on the third day." I felt a spark of the old defiance, the heat rising in my cheeks. "You want transparency? Fine, here's some. I am not a piece of evidence, and I am not a pet. I am a restorer. My hands are my life, and you took me from my studio without my kit. If I'm going to be trapped in this gilded cage, I want my tools, my pigments, my solvents, my precision scalpels. I need to work, Jae-sung. Without them, I'm just a ghost waiting for a funeral." Jae-sung leaned back, swirling the wine in his glass. The light caught the tattoo on his neck, making the ink look like it was pulsing. "Work is a distraction you can't afford." "Work is the only thing that makes me me," I countered, leaning forward into the candlelight. "You talk about protection, but you're stripping away everything that isn't under your thumb. If you want me to talk, if you want me to trust you with the names in that book, give me back my life, give me my tools." A silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I expected an icy refusal, another reminder of my status as his property. Instead, Jae-sung set his glass down and stood, his towering height eclipsing the light. He walked the length of the table, stopping just inches from my chair. He leaned down, his gloved hand gripping the back of my seat, caging me in. "A fair trade," he murmured, his dark eyes searching mine. "Your tools will be here by morning, but remember this, Seraphine. Those tools stay within these walls, just like you." True to his word, the morning light revealed a heavy, brushed steel case sitting on the obsidian console in the foyer. Inside, my precision scalpels, my squirrel hair brushes, and my palette of pigments lay nestled in their velvet slots. Touching them felt like reclaiming a part of my soul that Jae-sung had surgically removed in the parking garage. But as I lifted a fine-tipped blade, I realized the tools weren't a gift, they were a down payment. "They are in excellent condition," Jae-sung's voice drifted from the sun-drenched balcony. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt today, sleeves rolled up to reveal the heavy ink that mapped his forearms. He held a tablet in one hand, his eyes scanning a digital schematic. "Your father spoke often of your precision. He said you could separate a canvas from its backing without disturbing a single molecule of the original paint." "My father talked too much," I replied, my fingers tightening around the scalpel. "Why am I really here, Jae-sung? You have an army of men. You have enough technology to see through walls. You don't need a restorer to hide a ledger." Jae-sung walked toward me, his presence swallowing the light in the room. He tapped the tablet, and an image of a masterpiece flickered to life. The celestial dragon, a national treasure currently held in the vault of the Blue Moon auction house. I don't want to hide a ledger, Seraphine. I want to swap one. The syndicate's primary record of accounts is hidden in the inner lining of that scroll. If the scroll is damaged, if the seal is broken by an amateur, the ink inside the ledger is rigged to chemically combust. It's a dead man's switch for data. My breath caught. I knew that scroll. It was centuries old, the silk so fragile it could disintegrate under a heavy thumb. You're insane. That auction is the most heavily guarded event in Asia, and that silk, it's like breathing on a spider web. Exactly, he murmured, stepping into my space until the scent of his sandalwood cologne was all I could breathe. He reached out, his thumb grazing the pulse point at my throat, which was thrumming with a frantic rhythm I couldn't hide. Every other expert I could hire would tremble, they would sweat, they would fail, and they would die. But you have a reason to be perfect. Because you're holding me captive? I challenged, though the heat of his proximity was melting my resolve. No, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk. Because you want to be the woman who took back her life from the men who destroyed your father. I'm not just asking you to restore a painting, Seraphine. I'm asking you to perform a miracle under the noses of the syndicate. In exchange, I don't just give you your tools, I give you the world. I'll fund your studio, I'll erase the debts, and I'll make sure Vernon and his cleaners never breathe the same air as you again. He leaned down, his forehead almost touching mine. But you have to trust me, you have to be my hands, and I will be your shield. I looked at the scalpel in my hand, then into the icy gold flecks of his eyes. The deal was signed in the air between us, long before I nodded. I wasn't just his prisoner anymore, I was his accomplice. The midday sun was a blistering weight against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the villa, but the air inside remained sharp and cool. I found Jae-sung in the lower level of the estate, a space of raw steel and heavy shadows that smelled of iron and sweat. He was alone, his back to me, as he worked a heavy punching bag. The rhythmic, brutal thud of his knuckles against the leather echoed through the vaulted room like a heartbeat. He wasn't wearing the crisp silk shirts or the tailored overcoats that acted as his armor. He was bare-chested, his skin slick with a fine sheen of perspiration that made the ink of his tattoos appear alive. As he moved, the light caught the jagged, pale lines that disrupted the art on his back, scars that weren't meant to be seen. They weren't the clean surgical marks of the wealthy, they were the messy, violent signatures of a man who had crawled out of a grave to claim a throne. I stood in the doorway, my breath hitching as he delivered the final, devastating blow that sent the bag swinging wildly. He stayed there for a moment, head bowed, his shoulders heaving. He looked less like a king and more like a soldier who had forgotten how to stop fighting. "The restoration equipment has been calibrated," I said, my voice sounding small in the vast industrial space. Jae-sung didn't turn around immediately. He grabbed a white towel, wiping the sweat from his neck, before slowly facing me. The intensity in his eyes hadn't faded, but the boss mask was cracked. Up close, the scars were even more vivid, a long, thin line across his ribs, a starburst of puckered skin near his shoulder. "You're staring, Seraphine," his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "They look like they hurt," I murmured, stepping closer than I knew was safe. My hand moved instinctively, my fingers hovering just inches from the mark on his ribs before I caught myself. I've spent my life fixing things that are broken, trying to make sure no one can see the damage. But you carry it like a map. Jae-sung reached out, his hand wrapping around my wrist. He didn't pull me away, but he didn't let me touch him either. He just held me in that charged, agonizing space between us. Every one of these marks is a reminder of a mistake I didn't make twice, he said, his thumb tracing the delicate skin of my inner wrist. In my world, vulnerability is a death sentence, but here, he looked around the empty gym, then back at me, his gaze softening into something that felt dangerously like trust. Here, there is no one left to kill. He released my wrist, but the heat of his grip remained. For the first time, I didn't see the man who had kidnapped me or the man who wanted to use my skills to swap a ledger. I saw the cost of his power. The silence between us stretched, no longer filled with the threat of violence, but with a heavy, magnetic pull that made the air feel thick as honey. "Why me, Jae-sung?" I whispered. "You could have forced me. You could have threatened me. Why the silk robes? Why the tools?" He stepped into my space, his chest a wall of heat and scarred ink. "Because I don't just want your hands, Seraphine," he murmured, his face dropping close to mine. "I want you to choose to stay, even when the doors are unlocked." The training wasn't about art, it was about armor. Jae-sung had transformed the drawing room into a mock ballroom, the air thick with the scent of lilies, and the cold metallic tang of the hidden weapons his men were calibrating in the hallway. I stood in the center of the floor, wearing a pair of 4-inch stilettos that felt like glass shards against my soles, and a floor-length gown that clung to me like a silken shadow. "A restoration artist hides in the details," Jae-sung said, his voice a low vibration behind me. "But a woman of the syndicate, she owns the room so completely that no one dares to look at what her hands are doing." He stepped closer, his presence a towering heat that made the fine hairs on my neck stand up. He reached out, his gloved fingers catching my chin and tilting it upward. "Higher, Seraphine. You aren't a servant. You are the reason these men breathe. If you look down, you look guilty. If you look at them, you look like a threat. Look through them." He began to lead me in a slow, simulated waltz, but there was no music, only the sound of our breathing and the rustle of silk. His hand moved from my chin to the small of my back, his palm large and unyielding, pressing me closer until I could feel the rhythmic thud of his heart through his dress shirt. Every time I stumbled, his grip tightened, caging me against the solid wall of his chest. "You're too stiff," he murmured, his breath ghosting over my ear. "Relax into the power. If I am the blade, you are the velvet sheath. They need to see a couple so consumed by each other that they wouldn't notice a ledger disappearing in plain sight." He spun me around, and suddenly I was backed against a marble pillar, his body pinning me there. The physical proximity was no longer a lesson, it was a provocation. My hands, usually so steady with a scalpel, were trembling as they rested against his shoulders. I could see the icy gold flecks in his eyes deepening, a hunger surfacing that had nothing to do with the Korean syndicate. "Is this part of the act?" I whispered, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. Jae-sung leaned in, his nose brushing against mine, his thumb tracing the swollen line of my lower lip. The mask of the icy Mafia Boss didn't just crack, it shattered. The best lies are built on a foundation of truth, Seraphine. His hand slid up my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, pulling just enough to make me gasp. The tension between us, which had been simmering since that first night in the studio, reached a breaking point. The world outside the villa, the debts, the cleaners, the priceless scroll, faded into a blur. There was only the heat of his skin, the weight of his obsession, and the terrifying realization that I was no longer acting. "If we do this," I breathed, "there's no going back to the way things were." "Good," he growled, his lips inches from mine. "I never liked the way things were." He pulled me flush against him, his possessiveness surging like a physical force. In that moment, the training ended and the reality began. I wasn't just learning to be a mafia queen, I was becoming his. The grand auction was a sea of glittering masks, sharp tuxedos, and the heavy, invisible scent of old money and fresh blood. The Blue Moon auction house felt less like a gallery and more like a gladiatorial arena. As we stepped into the grand ballroom, the weight of Jae-sung's hand on my lower back was the only thing keeping me upright. My emerald gown trailed behind me like a silken warning, and I kept my chin high, looking through the men who had once hunted me as if they were made of glass. "Stay focused," Jae-sung murmured into my hair, his voice a low, grounding hum. "You are the finest restorer in the world. This is just another canvas." But the canvas was the celestial dragon scroll, resting in a temperature-controlled glass case at the center of the room. It was the centerpiece of the night, and hidden within its silk layers was the data that could dismantle the syndicate forever. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs as we circled the case. The air was thick with the presence of my enemies. Vernon was there, eyes narrow and searching, alongside high-ranking mobsters who smelled of iron and expensive tobacco. The moment came during the final bidding war for a secondary piece. Jae-sung created the opening, engaging a group of high-level officials in a sharp, distracting debate about the scroll's provenance. I slipped into the shadows of the display alcove. My hands, usually so steady with a scalpel, were suddenly unnervingly steady. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown, pulling out the micro scalpel and the decoy ledger. Every second felt like an hour. I worked with the precision of a ghost, slicing the microscopic seal of the scroll's casing. The fragile silk groaned under my touch, but I didn't breathe. I swapped the encrypted ledger, sliding the original into my bodice, just as a heavy shadow fell across the glass.
"Seraphine?" I froze. Vernon was standing 5 feet away, his face twisted in a mask of realization. He saw the shimmer of the scalpel in my hand. He opened his mouth to shout, his hand reaching for the concealed weapon at his hip. Before the first note of his alarm could leave his throat, the world turned into a blur of black silk and brutal motion. Jae-sung hadn't been distracted. He had been waiting. He appeared behind Vernon like a shadow made of solid stone. In one fluid, terrifying movement, Jae-sung's hand clamped over Vernon's mouth, while the other gripped his arm. There was a sickening crack, the sound of bone meeting absolute authority. Jae-sung didn't use a gun. He used the raw, primal violence of a man who had seen his obsession threatened. He drove Vernon into the marble pillar with a force that shattered the stone, his eyes burning with an icy, lethal gold. The room went silent, the bidding stopping mid-breath as the boss revealed the monster beneath the suit. "My wife is admiring the art, Vernon," Jae-sung growled, his voice a terrifying vibration that filled the hall. "If you interrupt her again, I won't just break your arm, I'll break your world." He stepped back, adjusting his cuffs as if he hadn't just committed an act of public execution. He reached for my hand, his grip warm and possessive, pulling me flush against his side. The ledger was heavy against my skin, a cold victory. "We're leaving," he said, his eyes scanning the room of stunned enemies, daring any of them to move. We walked out of the ballroom not as fugitives, but as the only people in the room left standing. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the swap vanished the moment the heavy armored doors of the villa hissed shut behind us. Outside, the night was screaming with the sirens of a city in chaos. Within 20 minutes of our departure from the auction, the digital payload I'd swapped into the syndicate scroll had done its work, triggering a cascading failure of their encrypted accounts. From the window of the coastal fortress, I could see the distant flickering lights of Seoul, a city currently being purged of the men who had hunted me. Jae-sung stood by the obsidian console, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his white shirt stained with a spray of blood that wasn't his. He was on the phone, his voice a series of low, brutal commands that sealed the fates of his rivals. Vernon, the cleaners, the board members of the syndicate, one by one, they were being erased. The Blood Moon wasn't just the name of the auction, it was the name of the massacre Jae-sung had orchestrated to ensure my safety and his supremacy. He ended the call and turned to me. The icy gold flecks in his eyes were burning with a terrifying, dark triumph. He looked at my hands, the hands that had performed a miracle under the noses of killers, and then he looked at the red bikini I had worn under my gown, a flash of silk and defiance that still seemed to haunt him. "It's done," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that traveled down my spine. "The ledger is in federal hands. The syndicate is headless. Vernon was found at the docks. He won't be bothering you again. Or anyone else." I took a shaky breath, the weight of the last 48 hours finally settling into my bones. So, the debt is paid. The 48 hours are up. Jae-sung walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator who had finally cornered the only thing that mattered. He stopped inches away, the scent of gunpowder and sandalwood clinging to him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small encrypted keycard. He held it out, his thumb grazing my palm as I took it. "The lease on your new studio," he murmured, "the funds for your restoration project. Everything we agreed upon is in that account. You are a ghost no longer, Seraphine. You are free." I looked at the card, then up at him. The door to the foyer was unlocked. The laser grid was dark. For the first time since the parking garage, the cage was truly open. But as I looked into his eyes, I didn't see a man saying goodbye. I saw an obsession that had only just begun to take root. His gaze didn't stay on my face. It tracked the pulse at my throat, the curve of my shoulder, the way I was breathing in his space. "I'm free to go?" I whispered, testing the words. "You are," he said, but his hand didn't move from my waist. His grip tightened almost imperceptibly, his fingers splaying across my ribs in that familiar, possessive claim. "But you both know that freedom is a lonely thing, Seraphine. You can walk out that door and return to a world that doesn't know you, or you can stay here with the man who destroyed that world to keep you."
He leaned down, his lips ghosting against my ear. "Choose, but know that if you stay, I will never let you be invisible again." The scent of expensive oil paints and aged turpentine no longer felt like a death sentence. It smelled like an empire. 1 year had passed since the night the syndicate fell, and the name Seraphine Vale was now spoken in hushed, reverent tones from the auction houses of Paris to the private collections of Tokyo. My new gallery in the heart of Seoul's Gangnam district was a temple of glass and light, housing the very masterpieces I had once been forced to hide in the shadows. I stood in the center of the main hall, dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk that flowed like liquid as I moved. The invisible girl was gone. In her place was a woman who commanded the attention of every dignitary and art mogul in the room. I was no longer restoring the past to pay for my father's mistakes. I was curating the future. Yet, even as I laughed with a French curator and signed off on a $1 million acquisition, I felt that familiar prickle at the base of my neck. It was a sensation I had grown to crave, the weight of a gaze so heavy and so specific that it could only belong to one man. I looked toward the darkened mezzanine, where the architectural shadows were deepest. There, leaning against a steel railing, stood Jae-sung. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo to match the gala's dress code. He was in his signature black overcoat, his silhouette a sharp, predatory contrast to the colorful elegance of the party below. He remained in the darkness, a silent sentinel who preferred the cold comfort of the wings to the heat of the spotlight. The laser grids were gone. The coastal fortress had become a weekend retreat rather than a prison. I had my own keys, my own staff, and a life that was entirely my own. The cage was wide open, yet I found myself returning to his side every single night. As the crowd began to thin, Jae-sung descended the stairs. He didn't rush. He moved with that same terrifying certainty that had first drawn me into his orbit. When he reached me, he didn't offer a polite handshake or a distant nod. He stepped directly into my space, his hand finding the small of my back in an unmistakable gesture of ownership. The heat of his palm through my silk dress was a silent reminder of the 48 hours that had changed everything. "You look devastating, Seraphine," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that only I could hear. "The world finally sees what I've known since the beginning." "And what is that?" I asked, leaning back just enough to see the icy gold flecks in his eyes. "That you were never meant to be invisible," he said, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a feather-light touch. "You were meant to be mine." I looked at the gallery, my dream realized, my freedom won. And then I looked at the man who had burned down a world to give it to me. The bond between us wasn't built on debts or threats anymore. It was built on the dangerous, exhilarating choice to be together. I reached up, my fingers grazing the tattoo on his neck, and smiled. The restoration was complete. The masterpiece was finally whole. And as we walked out of the gallery together, the shadows of Seoul felt less like a threat and more like home. Because in the end, the most beautiful thing I had ever restored wasn't a painting. It was my own heart, held firmly in the hands of the man who refused to let me go.